The first time I noticed it, I almost laughed. Ambassador Elena Cho was sitting across from me at the long glass table in the council chamber, and someone from the Yultharian delegation had just spent 10 minutes explaining why humanity's request for expanded trade routes needed further contextual review. Elena didn't argue. She didn't ask a single follow-up question. She just nodded, made a small note, and let it go. I remember thinking, that's strange. The Elena I knew from the shuttle rides over would have pushed back. She always pushed back. But that day, she simply closed her folder and moved to the next item on the agenda like nothing had happened. I was her aide. My job was to sit 2 seats behind her, take notes, and understand things she didn't have time to explain. I had been doing this job for 6 years, ever since humanity was granted a junior seat on the Galactic Council. And in those 6 years, I had learned to read the room better than most translators could read language. So when Elena let that trade request die without a fight, I wrote it down in my private notes. Not because it seemed important, because it seemed unlike her. I didn't know then that I was watching the first thread of something enormous begin to unravel. Let me back up and explain what the council actually was, because if you weren't there, it's easy to imagine something grand and fair. It wasn't. The Galactic Council was ancient, older than human civilization by tens of thousands of years. It had over 400 member species, each with different customs, different histories, and different ideas about what cooperation meant. On paper, it was a place where problems were solved together. In practice, it was a maze of committees, subcommittees, and procedural rules so thick that a simple proposal could take a decade to pass. Humanity had joined this maze only 20 years before I was born. We were, by every measure the Council used, young, loud, emotional, a species that had fought its own wars not that long ago, by their calendar. Many delegates treated us the way an old professor treats a first-year student who talks too much in class, with a kind of tired patience that was really just condescension wearing a polite face. At first, we tried to play along. I remember stories my parents told me about the early days, how human diplomats showed up to every session with binders full of proposals, ideas about clean energy sharing, medical research exchanges, defense coordination for smaller colonies near dangerous border zones. We came in eager, we came in loud, yes, but we came in wanting to help and wanting to be heard. And almost every single time, we were slowed down, not rejected outright. That would have been too obvious, too easy to point to. Instead, our proposals were tabled for further study, sent to committees that met once a year, buried under procedural questions about formatting, wording, translation accuracy. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was just how the Council worked. Slow, careful, endlessly cautious, built by species who had all the time in the galaxy and none of the urgency. But humans don't experience time the way some of these species do. 20 years to a race that lives for 2,000 years is nothing. 20 years to us is an entire generation. The moment that changed everything, the moment I think about the most, even now, happened during my second year on the job. A human mining colony on the edge of contested space, a place called Meridian Outpost, was hit by a resource crisis. Their water purification systems failed during a season when temperatures on the surface climbed high enough to make the surface unlivable without proper filtration. It wasn't a large colony, maybe 11,000 people, but it was ours. Elena filed an emergency request for the Council to authorize rapid aid. Ships from a nearby depot, operated by a neutral species called the Thren, were close enough to reach Meridian in days. All it needed was Council approval to redirect neutral supply lines, since the depot technically belonged to Joint Council resources. The request was filed on a Tuesday. It was placed on the agenda for expedited review. I remember sitting in that chamber and watching the debate stretch on. Some delegates raised concerns about setting a precedent. Others wanted assurances that human colonies wouldn't make a habit of requesting emergency exceptions. One representative, from a species I won't name, spent nearly 40 minutes discussing whether the request violated Resource Allocation Protocol Section 14, Subsection 9. The vote didn't happen until the following Monday. By then, the crisis had already resolved itself. Badly. Meridian's engineers managed a workaround using older, less efficient systems, but not before conditions on the outpost grew dangerous enough that emergency shelters had to be used for nearly 2,000 residents. Nobody was seriously hurt in the end. We were lucky, but it was close. and it never should have been close. I watched Elena during that final vote, the one that came too late to matter. She didn't say a word. She simply withdrew the request before anyone had the chance to vote on it, since it was no longer needed. Then she thanked the council for its time, exactly as protocol required, and sat back down. I asked her afterward if she was angry. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Anger doesn't fix anything here," she said. "It just gives them another thing to schedule a meeting about." I didn't understand what she meant then. I understand it now. After Meridian, something shifted, though it was so gradual that if you weren't watching closely, you might have missed it entirely. Human delegates stopped filing as many proposals, not because we ran out of ideas, we never ran out of ideas, but because we stopped expecting them to matter. Where Elena once submitted detailed, ambitious plans for cross-species medical research, she now submitted the bare minimum required to maintain good standing. Where human scientists once shared breakthroughs freely at council science exchanges, hoping to build goodwill, those exchanges slowly grew thinner. A new discovery here, a small update there, nothing that would actually move the needle. I want to be clear, nothing about this looked dramatic from the outside. There were no walkouts, no speeches, no formal complaints. If you were an outside observer glancing at the council floor, you might have thought humanity was simply losing interest, becoming a smaller, quieter presence among giants. Several delegates said exactly that, sometimes within earshot of our own team, as if we weren't capable of understanding their language, even after 20 years of speaking it fluently. "They're finding their place," one Thren delegate said to another, not quite bothering to lower her voice. "Every young species eventually learns its size." I remember Elena's expression when she heard that. She didn't react. She simply kept walking. It took me longer than it should have to realize what was actually happening. Humanity wasn't losing interest. Humanity was making a decision, quietly, patiently, over years, the way you might slowly stop calling a friend who never calls you back, until one day you realize you haven't spoken in months, and you don't quite feel the loss you expected to feel. The thing about the Galactic Council, the thing none of the older species seemed to grasp, was how much of the system's daily function depended on things humanity did without ever asking for credit. Human engineers had, over the years, become responsible for calibrating a huge portion of the long-range communication relays used across contested border zones, not because we were asked to formally, but because we were fast, reliable, and didn't demand endless committee approval to fix a broken relay station. Human medical teams had quietly become the backbone of emergency response along 3 major trade corridors, arriving faster than official council response units because we didn't wait for permission first. Human cargo ships, known for their speed and adaptability, carried a disproportionate share of the council's actual physical goods between systems, filling gaps that official transport authorities were too slow or too bureaucratic to fill themselves. None of this was official. None of this appeared on any formal council record as essential human contribution. It was just what we did, quietly, consistently, without asking for applause. And so when humanity finally, formally withdrew from the council, it didn't look like much on paper. I was there the day it happened. There was no vote, no debate, no dramatic speech. Elena stood at the podium, the same podium where she'd once presented 40-page proposals full of hope, and read a single short statement. "Humanity thanks the council for the opportunity to participate in this body," she said. "After careful consideration, we have determined that continued membership no longer serves the interests of our people. Effective immediately, humanity withdraws all formal participation, resources, and personnel from council operations. We wish the council continued success." That was it. Less than 30 seconds. She didn't wait for questions. She gathered her folder, nodded once to the chamber, and walked out. I followed her, along with the rest of our small delegation. Nobody ran. Nobody looked back. For a few days, nothing seemed to change. The council chamber continued its meetings. Some delegates made jokes about humanity's dramatic exit, predicting we'd return within a season, humbled and asking to be let back in. I heard one representative say, almost cheerfully, that this would finally give the council room to operate at a proper pace, without human impatience disrupting the rhythm of things. But then the relays started failing, not all at once. First it was small delays, a communication lag here, a supply ship arriving a day late there. Then entire sections of the border communication network began dropping out for hours at a time, because the engineers who used to fix them within minutes were no longer stationed nearby, no longer answering calls that used to come through informal, unofficial channels built on years of quiet trust. Then the medical response times along the trade corridors began slipping. A cargo accident that once would have seen human medical teams on site within the hour instead waited nearly a full day for an official council unit to be dispatched through proper channels. Nobody died. I want to be careful and honest about that. But for the first time, delegates who had spent years dismissing human contributions as minor began quietly asking questions in private meetings. Questions like, who exactly was handling this before? I sat in on several of those meetings, still technically employed as a minor communications liaison, even after our formal delegation left. I watched confusion slowly turn into concern, and concern slowly turn into something like alarm, as species realized how much of their daily operations had rested on a foundation nobody had bothered to properly acknowledge. Attempts were made to reach out. Official messages were sent to human diplomatic channels, requesting renewed dialogue, offering renewed terms, even hinting at expedited review processes, the very kind of urgency humanity had asked for during the Meridian crisis and never received. The response, when it came, was brief and polite. It thanked the Council for its message and stated that current arrangements did not include renewed formal Council participation at this time. No anger, no demands. Just calm, unwavering distance. I think about that response often. There was no bitterness in it. No desire to prove a point or make anyone suffer for what had happened. It read exactly like every polite refusal humanity had received over the years. Simply returned in kind, patient, procedural, and absolutely final. I stayed at the Council for another year after that, watching from a smaller office as the slow adjustments continued. Some species adapted quickly, building their own systems to replace what humanity had quietly provided. Others struggled longer, learning the hard way just how much unseen effort had been holding certain corners of their galaxy together. What struck me most in the end wasn't the disruption itself. Disruptions happen. Systems break and get rebuilt. What struck me was how quiet the whole thing had been, how humanity never needed to make a scene to be understood. We had spent years being patient, being reasonable, following every rule exactly as written, and being told, gently but constantly, that we didn't quite belong at the center of things. So we simply stopped waiting to belong there. I don't know if the Council ever truly understood what happened, not in the way I understood it, sitting 2 seats behind Elena for all those years. I don't think they ever grasped that humanity's silence wasn't surrender. It was a decision, made slowly, made carefully, and made without a single raised voice. Sometimes the loudest thing a person can do is simply stop showing up, and by the time anyone notices the absence, the decision has already been made a very long time ago.